follows an extract from my book Fête Fatale, available from Amazon. Chapter 12, Part 2. Seeing lights still on in the studio, Beth shouted hello to Drew and joined him as he sat still painting. "I'm surprised you're still up," she said. "I'd got a late-night motorbike race live from abroad playing on the computer, so I thought I'd just keep on painting while it was on. Did you have a good evening?" "I've had a very strange evening. Rehearsal went well, apart from the basses making up notes as usual. I think that Mozart knew his stuff better than the men in that section, not that they'd recognise the fact. I do wish they'd stop meddling with the harmonies." Neither Betty or Eileen were at rehearsal, which was most unusual, so May and I went on a mission of discovery once practice was over. We drove around and finally found Eileen at Betty's house. I still can't quite believe it. It hasn't sunk in yet. But Eileen went to pick Betty up as usual and found her at home dead. I know that she was getting on a bit, but all the same, it's quite a shock. Bobby Maddox and Dr. Wainwright were there when we arrived, and apparently Benji is on his way right now. He's probably at Betty's house as we speak. We've been calming Eileen down and settling her in at home. "Goodness, what a night you've had." Drew walked over to Beth and hugged and kissed her. "Well done for looking after Eileen. She must be quite shaken." "You know, I'm quite humbled at the depth of the friendship those two shared. They've been such good friends and for more years than I imagined. I've always presumed that Eileen was just being kind and taking Betty under her wing, in a patronising sort of way. If anything, it was initially Betty who took Eileen in hand years ago. When Eileen's husband died, Betty was patient and kind with her and took her along to the WI to try and get Eileen to look about her in her grief. You just never can tell what's going on in people's lives, can you? Well, we're always told not to judge a book by its cover. It's heartening to hear, though. It quite gives hope in mankind, doesn't it?" "Yes, it does. I'll tell you what does bother me, though. Why on earth does this warrant Benji travelling over? The death of an old lady, albeit a very lovely old lady, doesn't normally concern a detective chief inspector from Police HQ. That does raise a few concerns. I suppose you'll find out soon enough. Your brother is bound to tell you as much as he can, and probably a little more than that besides. With discretion, of course. Speaking of which, I'd better get cracking. I thought they'd be bound to be hungry when they've finished with all the red tape, and so I've invited them back here when they've finished. I also wanted to know exactly what's going on." "Ooh, you're a sly one. You buy information in exchange for food." "It always works, doesn't it? I was always taught that the way to a man's heart was through his stomach. I'm just taking the premise a few steps further." Walking to the fridge, Beth removed the fajita leftovers from their earlier meal and set them to steam in the wok. She bolstered the remnants by adding more courgette and green pepper. Turning the oven to a high heat, she sprayed olive oil onto a large stainless steel tray and sliced potatoes into wedges before spraying them with more olive oil and coating them liberally with allspice mix and setting them into a hot oven. Not many minutes before all was ready, the kitchen suddenly filled with the arrival of the doctor and the policeman. Beth gave her brother a hug and set to pouring out tea and coffee. "Now, why on earth would the death of a little old lady bring a detective chief inspector hurtling away from headquarters?" asked Beth. "I'd like to point out, first and foremost, that I never hurtle anywhere. I'm far too dignified for that. I'd also like to point out that I don't actually live at HQ. I was at home when the good doctor called," said James. "I am sorry for disturbing you from your evening's rest, James. Nevertheless, I really did think that I should keep you informed. Ordinarily, I'd have completed the paperwork with no qualms whatsoever. Betty had obviously had a heart attack. She was a regular patient of mine, and she had a known and mismanaged heart condition. I know that she took her medication in a haphazard manner, if at all. Although her complaint wasn't acute, Her age and general feebleness would easily account for her succumbing to even the smallest heart tremor. However, the similarities between Betty's death and John's, and in such a small space of time, were striking, far too alike to be ignored. I thought it best to notify you straight away. However, I must point out that you came hurtling here entirely by your own choice, said Dr. Wainwright. Of course I did. You know me. I'm a nosy Parker to the last, said James. I'd like to say that I'm mighty glad, sir, said Maddox. I'd hate to be in the same position that I was on the day of the fête. If it wasn't for what happened then, I'm sure that none of us would trouble over much about Betty's death. It's a bit too close for comfort, though, and I'm delighted that you did hurtle down here. It's nice to know that I'm appreciated, said James. As I have hurtled myself here, get on and dish out the rations, Beth. I'm starving. None of us think too well on an empty stomach, said James. Beth cast a wry glance at Drew, and they exchanged a knowing smile. The five of them sat around the kitchen and chatted over a midnight supper. I'm presuming that, as we're here amongst friends, can I speak freely and without reserve, said Dr. Wainwright. An encouraging nod from Inspector James indicated that this was so. Seeing that permission was granted, Wainwright continued. I think that we all know that Betty didn't take her medication as prescribed. I didn't worry too much, as I knew that it would be a case of her not bothering to take her pills at all, rather than her taking too many at once as a result of absent-minded muddling. Ultimately, I couldn't do much else other than encourage her to take the tablets as directed. I don't think her mismanagement was particularly due to forgetfulness. I rather thought that it was more a case of wanton stubbornness and a throwback of the old school pride in never swallowing a pill, but trusting to more abstract remedies such as goose grease or some other old wives' cure. You're right there, said Beth. When Emma brought Primrose to see you with her cold, Betty was chatting to her and quite freely admitted that she never bothered with the tablets. Apparently, she seemed almost girlishly proud of her boldness. That settles it then. I'd got my suspicions, but now we've confirmed it from source. However, I'm afraid that things don't stay as simple as that, said Wainwright. Once Maddox came on the scene, I had a scout around for the tablet bottles. I looked in all the obvious places that tablets might be kept, the bathroom cabinet, dressing table drawers, the bedside table, and so on. I didn't move anything but just had a look. I even used a hanky so I didn't leave any prints. I found a few bottles that I'd recently prescribed, but they were mostly all empty. Now it may be that she'd flushed them down the loo. These old dears refuse to get out of the habit of doing this, no matter how much I beg them not to. If she didn't flush them away, did she just suddenly take them all? I think that if this was the case, then the bottles would all be stashed together and probably near to hand where she died. If they disappeared by other means, then that's a matter for you boys in blue to look into. I don't want to put 2 and 2 together and make 5, but I rather think we've something of a problem on our hands. I think that now is as good a time as any for us to all lay our cards on the table. I'm wide awake if it suits you all the same. James looked around the table. Nobody seemed inclined to disagree. He gave a nod of assent, and Beth made a fresh round of drinks. I really can't imagine how the death of dear old Betty could be related to the death of John Barlow. I've had a good look around John's laptop contents, thanks to Beth's dubious network of friends. I was really surprised to see just how much was on there. He wasn't your average silver surfer. I'm definitely going to need to justify official access to the contents of that computer. His whole life is on there. He even kept a sort of diary cum journal on it. I did wonder if he felt that it was the only place where his wife wouldn't be inclined to look. He really put his heart and most private thoughts down at times. It was embarrassing to read, I can tell you, and I felt really shoddy for doing so. We've all got our job to do, though. Can you give us the gist of what you found? You can keep the personal stuff to yourself, asked Wainwright. Well, On a personal level, it's sufficient to say that he refers to his concerns about Jean's reaction to having to make necessary economies. This was reinforced by emails and letters to his accountant refusing to sell their own personal property in the south of France, which would have sold quickly and raised the much-needed capital. He mentions in the correspondence that he couldn't face Jean with the proposition, and it appears that he was too ashamed to broach the subject. It seems a bit extreme to me. He suggested that he would be willing to sell any of the Greek or Spanish properties, but the market there was too strangled to be of any immediate use. In his personal diary, he does give vent, quite rightly to my mind, to his feelings about Jean's response to having to cut back a little. I don't think that it was inappropriate to expect to have to eat in and wash your own dishes for the most part, and neither did John. It seems that she objected to having to adopt these basic domestic duties even if John offered to help out, said James. Poor John. He suffered from his own generosity. She'd had it so good and spent so many years on the gravy train that when she came to need to live a bit more like the rest of us, she couldn't hack it. I'll bet they were still exceptionally well off by our standards. I guess it's all relative. What a shame Jean couldn't enjoy the good that she still had. That begins to explain a strange comment that Hyacinth made. When talking to Conrad, John mentioned that it was actually the thought of Jean that was driving him to less honest business rather than away from it. He should have just told her to man up and tighten her belt. He was too soft for his own good, said Beth. Now that's very interesting. It brings me to the weirdest part of what I read. I know that John owned a nightclub or at least some sort of bar in Spain, which I doubt was common knowledge, said James. I can't imagine Jean giving her consent to that. It'd be far too seedy for her sensibilities, said Wainwright. There were a couple of emails to Spanish names that I didn't like the sound of. I'll have to do some digging around, but, believe it or not, I've a feeling that they belong to a protection racket group. If I'm right, then this takes us into very troubled waters. I can't think of any way imaginable how the death of an old lady like Betty can have links with the likes of this. I find it crazy enough to see how John could have had anything to do with these guys. I'll have to see where the road takes me as I scout around, said James. Hyacinth said that Conrad had told him not to be stupid, but I don't think she had any idea that it went that far, said Beth. We don't know that these deaths are linked at all, but I think we're going to have to approach both of them as suspicious for the time being. I've got Forbes and his chums from the forensics lab on the job as we speak, and Bruff is already in the loop as far as necessary, said James. Maddox, first thing tomorrow I need you to have a good look through Barlow's bank accounts. I'm specifically after any large and unexplained withdrawals or deposits. I also want you to have another word with Jefferson. See if he has any light to shed on these dodgy characters. James handed Maddox a list of names. They looked like they belonged in an old gangster movie. Don't give too much away about the whole mafioso thing, just see what he'll offer voluntarily. Righto, sir. I'll ask him to come to the station. He didn't like me upsetting his wife when I turned up unannounced last time, said Maddox. What a shame that you had to hurt his feelings. Well, it never does to upset the ladies. Sort it out as you like, said James. I have an awkward point of enquiry, said Drew. I'm working on a project with Conrad. It's on the easel right now. Does that pose a problem for you, Benji? I don't see that it does. Thankfully, under British law, an individual is innocent until proven guilty. I'm not even sure what it is that he could be guilty of. Not bumping off old ladies, of that I'm sure. Carry on as normal, Drew, but listen out for anything of interest. That goes for all of us, said James. In the meantime, I'm going to squeeze something from the toxicology lab. They must have some droplets of wisdom for me by now, even if the tests aren't completed in duplicate and triplicate. That's the trouble with these scientific types. They're so keen on absolute accuracy. which is all well and good in its place, but they can't step outside the red tape for a millisecond. I bet they've probably got a good idea and could tell me a good deal already, but daren't break the mould by chatting to me before I've got the papers in my hand. For the full book of Fête Fatale, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.